Thanks, Robin. Just dawned on me, Robin was right. I have way too many slides, so I'll waste no time. Four major trends. I think a lot of speakers already talked about them. The climate deal, the sustainable development goals, which I don't have to go into because Alice covered that gloriously. Modern slavery and millennials. Millennials get holistic thinking, they get sustainability, and they get life cycles and circular economy, and that's what I want to talk about. This is the future decision makers, consumers, and leaders, so that's the way the world is heading. Starting with the climate deal, so this was monumentous. It was a huge thing. It's in policies, it's everywhere, it's getting traction. And what we really need to do, the key point from the climate deal in Paris is, this is where we're heading, the gray bar. This is what we need to change to. 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees ideally means we need to be carbon neutral in our lifetime. In the next 30 to 50 years, we need to be zero carbon economy. And no one really knows what that's going to look like. No one has an idea, but that's where we need to get to. So every organization here needs to change course and get on this trajectory today, if we're going to have a chance. And what's coming out of this is what's called a science-based target initiative. So this is very much based on Carbon Disclosure Project, being open and transparent about what your carbon emissions are and what you're doing about it. But now it's organizing it so that we align with the 2-degree trajectory, or ideally the 1.5-degree trajectory. This has been in place for probably a year, and you already have massive uptake. There's 208 companies around the world that signed up for this, a couple of them in Australia, Australian Ethical, Westpac, Origin, etc. Just browse over, you see it's all big brands, big names doing this. Alice mentioned Walmart before. And this is what they're doing. They're developing a scientific approach, taking a scientific approach to what does my mitigation strategy and my mitigation target need to look like. And there's a few common themes. This international train operator, intensity targets, reduce greenhouse gas emissions per functional unit, per intensity, per service delivered. International power company, per kilowatt hour, they want to reduce the CO2 intensity. They know they need to start shut down fossil fuel power plants. And they know they need to be carbon neutral, so they're committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. Walmart, they have their scope 1 and 2, which is quite trivial because it's their stores really and some trucks. Their supply chain is the main one. And they've committed to 1 billion tons of removal of carbon dioxide between 2015 and 2030. That doesn't have to be science-based, that just have to be ambitious because it's someone else's scope 1 and 2. But they're working on that right now. How can we get 1 billion tons of emissions away from our supply chain and in the consumption phase as well of the products and services or products that we sell in our stores? So that's science-based targets. It's having a huge impact massively, and there's a lot of interest in it, and you're going to hear a lot about it if you haven't already. Now, what we can learn from life cycle thinking and life cycle assessment is for 80% of the economy, on average, the scope 1, so the bills you pay, the electricity and the fuel, etc., it's only about 20% of your actual emissions, and 80% is actually in your supply chain, upstream or downstream. So you really need to take a life cycle approach and holistic approach. It's only 20% of the economy where 80% of the scope 1 and 2 emissions are 80% of the total emissions. So for most of us, it's all about supply chain. It's all about the services and products out in the market. And that's what we need to focus on. That's where circular economy comes in as a really interesting topic because it challenges the traditional linear thinking. You know, you make something, you use it once or twice, and then you waste it, and then you make a new product. This is about different levels of reuse, recycling, upcycling, and there's a hierarchy of what's best. And what's best is a product that goes around without much maintenance or much refurbishment or repair that can be used over and over again. That's the ideal. That's where we want to get to, dematerialize. And this is a huge opportunity. I estimate it's about $4.5 trillion of added value to the economy just from applying circular economy concepts. An example, a couple of years ago, I started working in the pallet industry, working with pallet companies, and I've been obsessed ever since. It's a fascinating industry. I'm not proud to say it by any means, but it really is. There's more than one pallet for each of us in the world right now, and we're making 5 billion new pallets. So you can imagine the waste. 93% of all these pallets are from wood, so we're cutting down massive forests just to put stuff on it and transport it and throw it away. a very good example of the linear economy, and we have a huge waste issue in New South Wales and worldwide. In Australia, we're cutting down sustainably managed forest. Most of this is from tropical forest, hardwood, not sustainably managed at all. So it's a big impact. There is a remedy. There's pooling. You've probably seen these red and blue SHEP, loss-cam kind of pooled pallets. So they're in kind of a closed loop. They backhaul, repair, and refurbish. They own these pallets. They just rent them. So that's a circular concept. Now, question is, how does this stack up in a carbon world? The linear economy or the circular economy? And even going into SHEP is doing their pallets out of hardwood, loss-cam doing out of structural grade softwood pine. How does this stack up? And how can we apply life cycle assessment to get an answer? So life cycle assessment conceptually is looking at everything from raw materials, manufacture, transport, end of life, the whole cycle, and scientifically look at what's the quantum of emissions over this life cycle. And when we compare different pallets, this is the only really scientific, geeky slide I have, so don't worry. These are the pooled pallets. Softwood, which would be the loss-cam, SHEP, and plastic. And this is the softwood one way, where you just cut down, you transport it, and then you throw it away, basically. This one, cardboard one way, you know what that one's called in marketing terms? The eco pallet. This is breakdown of the pooled pallets. There is no end of life. It's circular, and it's an equal distribution of all life cycle stages. An appropriate investment in raw materials, in manufacturing, in backhauling, in repairs. That's a balanced life cycle. It's not zero, but it's significantly better than the conventional that makes up the majority of pallets. So there is hope. There's a future for this. Another one. This is the greatest company we work with, one of the greatest ones. Repal. They've just been launched on the ASX in Australia. They do plastic pallets from plastic waste. Mixed waste, any waste. No one knows how they do it. They had a plastic professor look at the manufacturing and say, what you're doing is impossible. You're not supposed to be able to do it. They're setting up factories in Indonesia. They have a headquarter in Bali, which was great, kickoff meeting there. And this is what it looks like. They basically take dirty plastic, grind it up, clean it a bit, and then turn out pallets like this. And if they can replace 1% of the market of pallets in the world, 1%, they will use up all the plastic waste that's currently in the oceans. So I hope they succeed, and we're going to try to help them. There's other products coming out of ocean waste. The Pallet is one. An ex-employee of ours is in Chile picking up fishing nets from the ocean, making it into skateboards and sunglasses. This is Real Madrid and Bayern Munich football teams. They got a new uniforms made of, out of ocean plastic waste as well. Really great story. I hope they sell a lot of those. And what we learned, kind of cutting to the chase in life cycle assessment, because we've done hundreds of these, and it's always the same story, that every material has its own little story and intricacies, but product stewardship is the silver bullet. You can almost always get a great outcome from product stewardship, taking ownership, upcycle, take-back schemes, and applying the industrial ecology, the circular thinking, in terms of just breaking the linear, or at least bend the linear economy into a more circular concept. And you can basically remove the end-of-life concept. Shouldn't have to exist. There's no reason for it. But right now, in the construction, we see 75% of all concrete is downcycled. It might be ground up into road base or something. Landfill, most of the timber goes to landfill, such a waste. A lot of that is probably pallets. And then you have steel, which looks great on paper because you know it's infinitely recyclable, but you have to remelt it. It's very energy intensive. We have to start reusing steel and not recycling steel. It's really important. Modern slavery, I'll leave that to Zoe. Mostly, I'm just touching on it briefly. It is hitting the mainstream news. They have this, there's an index, there's a map, you know where the hotspots are, where the heat zones are. And in Australia, there's 4,300 people living in modern slavery conditions in Australia alone. So we're pretty naive if we think that sourcing Australian or we're not affected by it here. It is absolutely everywhere, in every country. No one's free from this. And all the discussions have been about how do we address this? How can we actually make a difference? What we're trying to apply is to, step one, visualize your supply chain. Map it out globally. See where your tier one suppliers are, domestic, international, tier two suppliers, so who's supplying your suppliers, and tier three. And then you start to see how it's spreading out across the globe. This is just going to tier three. it will continue. And then you look at the economic spend, how much you spend with each suppliers, and you overlay the risk in each country. So how much money is going into this country? What's the country risk of modern slavery or any other social indicator going on there? And then you get a heat map, a risk zone, if you will. And then you start looking at what do I know about the supply? Because you can have clean, green, risk-free supplies in China, even though it's a high-risk country, because you work with a supplier, you've been in the factories, you made sure that nothing strange is going on. But if you don't know, you have to assume it's the risk country, the risk of the average of the country. So this is one way where getting around kind of where do you know your supply chain? Do you know which countries they are at? I think this is the way we need to start mapping it out. So to wrap this up, I think we need to embrace that supply chains and products and life cycles are global. They're multifaceted. We can't just work on carbon or modern slavery or single indicators. We need to bring it all together and work with it in a coherent way by identifying the hotspots. So figure out what's most important. Is it the carbon footprint of the product I'm buying? Is it the modern slavery? Or is it a combination of both? Or is it some other environmental social indicator that I should be working on? And what are the key factors? So is it the recyclability of this product? Is it the repairability? Is it the low maintenance? You can use life cycle thinking to figure out where should I focus and what are the key factors, and benchmark. So what Jess mentioned, like benchmark, compare, I think that instigates and inspires competition, innovation. I'm better than everyone, or they're better than me. I have to improve and to use that to improve and to implement. So sustainable procurement is a great standard and process to actually systematically work with this and in a coordinated manner. So when the ISO standard comes out, I hope it's going to be a massive, rapid uptake and everyone's starting to work in a coordinated manner with sustainable procurement and communicate results. So sharing this, making everyone aware of what you're doing. Great to see Mervac is very open and transparent about what they're doing, putting it out there for everyone to learn. I think that's definitely the way to go.